So continuing on from the previous video, in this video we're going to carry on with compositing shot 2 by building our character asset. Now the character asset is going to be a little bit more complicated than our set asset. It's going to have a few more passes involved, and as we get more and more passes involved in compositing, we're going to eat up more and more of our memory, and this will quickly become a problem if not kept in check, because we'll cause Houdini to crash. So as we're working in compositing and eating up memory, how do we go about freeing up that memory? Well, we can come up to Edit, and we can tell Houdini to clear the compositing cache by using Alt plus Shift plus R. Now, just to show this, and you may want to do this as well, so you can keep an eye on your memory usage as working in compositing, down in the Task Manager we've switched over to Processes, and we've found hmaster.exe, and currently we can see its memory usage is at 136,000 K. As we start playing with sliders in Houdini, as we're changing things in compositing, watch this number climb higher and higher and higher. So right now we're just broke 200,000, 216. We can change some of the settings on our secondary spotlights. We're now at 226, and this will only get worse and worse the more passes we're working with and the more settings we're working with. So we're right here around the 246,000 K. If we wanted to then go and free up that memory with Houdini open, Alt, Shift and R is going to clear the compositing cache and takes us right back down to 130. So what I'm going to do while we're working and while we're changing parameters, I'm going to fairly frequently click Alt-Shift-R on the keyboard to keep freeing up our memory, just to avoid using up all of our memory and causing Houdini to crash. So with that, I'm just going to minimize our task manager. And we're going to begin by compositing the character. Now the character has both main spotlights and secondary spotlights, and we've already built an asset for compositing together our main spotlights and secondary spotlights, so we could reuse that. And the character also has rim diffuse, rim specular, fill diffuse and bounce, so why not reuse this for the main spotlights and secondary spotlights, and then we can build onto that asset to take into account our other passes that we have for the character. So I'm going to come over here to the side, push tab to bring up the tab menu, and grab our set comp from our digital assets. And since this is going to become part of our character, I'm going to rename it from set comp to something like main spots _ secondary spots. I'll bring my visibility down to this node. I'm going to Alt-Shift-R just in case that caused any memory to be eaten up. And we're going to change our passes over to our character's passes. So for the diffuse sequence, I'm going to bring up the browser, jump up a level, jump into our character folder, and grab the character _ main spots _ diffuse pass. Again, we're still working with shot 2. I'm going to double click on that and Control C to copy, paste that down into the specular pass, just so when I bring up the browser, I'm already in that character folder. And here we want the character main spots specular pass. The shadow pass for the main spotlights is going to be the same. If you recall, there's only one shadow pass for main spotlights for the entirety of shot 2. So over to secondary spotlights, I'm going to paste again into the diffuse sequence so that we come up in our shot 2 character folder. I'm going to get secondary spots diffuse. And again for the secondary spots specular sequence, I'm going to paste, bring up our browser and grab secondary spots specular. And our shadow sequence is going to be identical to the one we already had in there. So again, Alt-Shift-R to clear out our cache. So now that we've got our main spotlights and our secondary spotlights in place, let's go ahead and bring in the files for our other passes. So I'm going to click on the backtick to bring up the browser, and I'm going to grab our character bounce and shift click down to our character rim. So that's going to grab our character bounce, fill, and the rim diffuse and specular passes. And if we click on accept, that's going to bring those passes into Houdini. And let's deal with our character rim, diffuse and specular passes first. So I'm going to grab those, bring those up near our main spotlights, and then grab our bounce and fill and move those out of the way. So we've already seen if we're compositing diffuse and specular passes together, we're going to screen those. So I'm going to right click on the output of our character rim diffuse, create a new screen comp, enter to accept that, enter to drop that in, and wire our specular into the screen. So now we've got our rim light, both specular highlight and the diffuse. And I'm going to make sure that we're careful with our alpha. We switch over to our mask and make sure not to screen our alpha channel. And let's rename this to screen rim light. Now while you have our rim light in place, we saw in the previous video when we're combining multiple lights, we're going to add those together. So I'm going to add the result of our rim light to our main spots and our secondary spots. So I'm going to right click on the output of main spots, secondary spots, and create an add comp. Enter to drop that into our network, and let's wire our screen rim light into that and rename this to add rim light. Again, we need to be careful with our alpha, so I'm going to switch over to the mask tab and uncheck the alpha so that we're not including the alpha in the operation. And I'm going to Alt-Shift-R just to free up any memory we might be using. So with our bounce light and our fill light, we can simply add those in. We don't have to worry about any specular passes with these guys since they're just a diffuse. So I'm going to right click on the output of add rim light, create a new add comp, enter to drop that into our network and wire our fill light into that. Let's rename this to add fill. And as we bring our visibility down, we can see our fill light get added in. And again, let's be careful with our alpha. So on the mask tab, let's uncheck alpha for our plane scope. Finally, I'm going to right click and create a new add and wire our bounce into that. And this will be our add bounce light. If I spell that correctly, there we go. Bring our visibility down here, we can now see our bounce light coming into play. Again, making sure not to have alpha checked for the plane scope. I'll also bring our render flag down to that node, since when we collapse this into an asset, we want that to be the output of our asset. So we can see we've brought all our lights in for the character. We have control up on this screen with the foreground weight and background weight in order to control the rim light. Let's bring our visibility down so we can control the diffuse and specular components of our rim light. We also have control over the rim light as a whole on this add. If we change our background weight, we'll decrease or increase the rim light's contribution to our overall lighting. On the add for the fill, if we change the background weight, if we bring our visibility down, we have control over the intensity of the fill. And on our bounce light, we have the background weight, which gives us control over the intensity of our bounce light. So we can see that we can promote up some of these parameters, including the existing parameters we already had on our main spots and secondary spots instance of the set node, and we can promote those up to an asset and create a character asset for compositing. So I'm going to select all of these nodes except for our set comp, since set comp is for our set and all of these other nodes are for our character. And I'm going to push Shift-C to collapse those down to a subnet. And let's rename this to character comp. And I'm going to just double check that our render flag is set to the add bounce light. Indeed it is, so I'll jump back up. So I'm going to right click and create a digital asset from this subnet. And I want this asset to have the operator name of character comp with a capital C for comp, a label of character comp, and I'm going to save this into our compositing OTL that we already have on disk. So there's our compositing OTL, so I'm going to accept that to save into the compositing OTL and accept. And that's going to bring up our type properties. So with our type properties open, I'm going to switch over to the parameters tab, switch over to from nodes, and let's jump inside our character comp, and let's grab our characters main spotlights, secondary spotlights, and we can grab the main spotlights and secondary spotlights folders. Now before we do this, I do want to make sure that I uncheck prefix, link name and label so that we don't end up with overly wordy names and labels. So I've grabbed the main spotlights and secondary spotlights folder from the main spots secondary spots instance of our set comp asset. I'm going to click on the right arrow, and that's going to promote up all of those parameters. I do want to go ahead and create separators between our files and intensity settings, so I'm going to drag out 2 separators. And now we can create some new folders to deal with our character specific lights. So I'm going to create a folder for our rim lights. So let's create a rim lights folder, and let's just give ourselves some room to work in. Jump inside our character comp asset by double clicking, and let's promote up the files for our diffuse and specular for our rim lights. So I'm going to right click on the file and export parameter to type properties, and this will become our rim light diff file and the label diffuse sequence. And I'll do the same for our specular, so I'm going to right click, export parameter to type properties. The name will become rim light spec file and specular sequence, and I'll make sure that we put those inside our rim lights folder. It'd also be really nice to drop a separator in before we start continuing on with intensity value, so I'll drop in a separator. Now our rim lights, we have the control over our diffuse and specular intensities with the foreground and background weight respectively. So I'm going to right click, export our foreground weight, give this a name of rim light diff intens and the label of diffuse intensity. And I'll right click, export our background weight, give this a name of rim light spec intens and a label of specular intensity, and we'll make sure to put those inside our rim lights folder. Finally, for the rim light, we have this add rim light where the background weight gives us an overall control of the rim light. So I'm going to right click and export our background weight from the add rim light add cop, give this a name of rim light intens and a label of rim light overall intensity. And I'm going to make sure to put that above our diffuse and specular intensities. So that's our rim lights. Let's create a folder now for our fill light. So I'll create a new folder, and this will be for our fill light. And the fill light only has a single file, so we'll promote up the file on our fill light diffuse. So I'm going to right click and export that parameter to our type properties. I'll call this fill light diff file and a label of diffuse sequence. Make sure to put that in our fill light folder. And since we only have one file and one intensity control, I'm not going to worry about a separator here. And that intensity control is going to be the background weight on our add fill. So let's right click, export that parameter to our type properties, give this a name of fill light intens and a label of overall intensity. And I'll make sure to put that in the fill light folder. So we now only have our bounce light to be concerned about. So I'm going to create a final folder for our bounce light. I'll rename this to bounce light. And the bounce light is the exact same scenario as our fill light. We have a single file with a single intensity value. So I'm going to export the file for our bounce light. I'll call this bounce light diff file and give it a label of diffuse sequence. And then on the add bounce light, I'll export our background weight. So right click, export the background weight to our type properties, and this will be our bounce light intens, and I'll give this a label of overall intensity, which if I drop into our bounce light folder, we can now accept this and jump up to see our character comp asset. Now I'm going to play with all of the various parameters on our character comp asset, and when we do, I'm going to make sure after just a few slides on any of the sliders, I'm going to press Alt-Shift-R.
I'm just curious real quick, how much memory are we using?
We are using 171.
Not bad.
But I have been
pressing
Alt-Shift-R fairly frequently. But we'll play with this. Yep. I will keep pushing Alt-Shift-R just to make sure that we don't push our memory past the limits of our machine.
Another thing that I'd like to point out, while the compositor is a lot more stable than it used to be way back with older builds of Houdini, it's still a good idea as you start to find settings that you like to save your project often, because even though you're basically wiping out your cache memory, from time to time, it still may crash on you. So having things saved will make you a lot happier, save a lot of frustrating moments.
Do save files often, whether you're working with the compositor or whether you're working in SOPs or DOPs or COPs.
It really goes for any 3D application out there.
Save often. It's never a bad practice to get into. So let's start out by decreasing the intensity on all of our lights, and we should see our character turn to pure black. So let's delete the intensity on our main spot. Delete the intensity on our secondary spots, on our rim light, on our fill light, and finally we can see our bounce light. So I'm going to bring our bounce light in subtly. We can bring our fill light in very subtly. And if we bring the rim lights in now, they'll be very apparent with both their diffuse intensity and their specular. And we can bring in these secondary spots. We can see the illumination that's having. We could decrease the specular for those, or the diffuse. So you can see all the functionality we're getting just by reusing that set asset is really helping us out. And then we can bring in our main spotlights. You're going to notice that the shadows aren't going to be apparent on our character, so there's no real need to tweak our shadow intensities at this time. But with that, we've created our character compositing asset, and that means we've now composited both our set and our character, so we can move on in the next video to start actually bringing Shot 2 together.